The expression on my son's face changed in the span of a single breath. He stepped through my front door with a leather satchel in one hand and a man in a gray suit behind him. And then he stopped cold. His eyes moved from me to the woman sitting in the armchair by the window, and everything he'd planned to say seemed to evaporate right there in the hallway. Dad. His voice came out quieter than I'd heard in years. What is she doing here? I looked over at Gail, who was sitting with her legs crossed, and a mug of Tim Hortons balanced on the armrest, perfectly at ease, like she'd been living in that chair her whole life. She didn't answer him. She just looked at my son the way a person looks at someone they've been quietly expecting for a very long time. I lifted my own mug. Afternoon. Good of you to drive out. He didn't answer. The color had drained from his face. Standing in my living room in Kingston, Ontario, staring at a woman he hadn't seen in years, my son looked more rattled than I'd ever seen him as an adult. And in that moment, though I couldn't fully name it yet, I understood that everything was exactly as I needed it to be. My name is Lawrence Mercer. I'm 63 years old, and I spent 38 years working as a pipefitter in the industrial trades across eastern Ontario. It was hard work in the honest sense of that phrase. Early mornings, cold shop floors, winters where your knuckles cracked before you'd finished your first coffee. I was a union man from my first day as an apprentice. I earned my red seal. I eventually became a foreman, then co-ran a small mechanical contracting operation with a business partner for the last decade of my working life. When I retired 2 years ago, I wasn't wealthy, but I'd been careful, and careful compounds quietly over 38 years. My wife, Judith, died of a stroke 8 years ago. She was 57, the kind of death that doesn't give you time to prepare. For a long while afterward, the house felt enormous. My son was 31 then. The two of us held things together the way people do. Not gracefully, but honestly. Sunday dinners. Saturday nights watching hockey night in Canada. Spring mornings pulling the dead branches from the back hedge. Grief shared in small ordinary actions instead of spoken out loud. I want to be fair about who my son is, because none of what happened makes sense without that. He's 39 now. Smart in certain ways. Ambitious in certain ways. He married 7 years ago. His wife is organized, capable, and had a very clear idea from early on of how she wanted their life to look. A new build in a subdivision north of Kingston. 2 vehicles. A ski week in Tremblant every January. The kind of life that requires consistent maintenance. I had no quarrel with any of it. People choose what they choose. I've spent enough years in the trades to know that what a house looks like from the street tells you very little about what's happening with the finances inside it. The first sign came so gently I nearly missed it. My son had always called regularly, not every week, but enough. Gradually, those calls became shorter. The Sunday dinners became monthly, then occasional. When I suggested getting together, he was usually busy. When I called, he picked up but seemed distracted, like he was solving something else while we talked. I didn't hold it against him. Marriages take energy. Mortgages take everything that's left. Then the questions started. Dad, are you still managing everything all right on your own? Have you thought about downsizing? Might be easier with a smaller place. Do you have a financial advisor? Someone helping you look at the big picture? Each question, taken separately, sounded like concern. Together, they felt like something circling a subject without landing on it. One evening in October, I was watching the Leafs lose, as they do, when my son called, and after a few minutes of conversation, he asked whether I'd updated my will recently. Not recently, I said. You should think about it, Dad. At your age. I was 62. I'll keep it in mind, I said. He changed the subject. I didn't think about it much. I should have thought about it more. The call that actually stopped me in my tracks came from Alan, a foreman I'd worked alongside for 15 years. We had a standing coffee arrangement at the Tim Hortons on Princess Street, and when I sat down across from him that Tuesday morning, he had the look of a man who'd been rehearsing something on the drive over. After the usual conversation about retirement and our various joint problems, he said, Lawrence, I need to tell you something, and I hope it doesn't land wrong. Go ahead, I said. Your son mentioned to someone at the union retirees' lunch that you've been having some trouble keeping things straight, memory-wise. He looked uncomfortable. It came back to me through Pete Darling. Wasn't directed at me directly. I set my coffee down. He said it casually, Alan said, like he was worried. But the way it was framed, it was more than worried. I looked out the window at the parking lot. A woman was scraping frost off her windshield. The world looked completely normal. I felt like the floor had tilted slightly beneath my chair. That's the first I've heard of it, I said. Alan nodded. I figured it was. I drove home that afternoon and sat in my kitchen for a long time without doing anything in particular. I thought about all the conversations over the past year. The questions, the sudden interest in my house, the comments about my age. I kept trying to find the innocent interpretation. It's what you do when it's your own child. I called Gail that evening. Gail Hartley had been the bookkeeper for my contracting operation for nearly a decade. Before that, she'd done the books for several other trades, businesses around the Kingston area. She was sharp with numbers and sharper with people, and she had known my son since he was a teenager who occasionally showed up at the shop to ask for money. She had never particularly warmed to him, and he had always known it. When I finished telling her everything, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "When did you last review your estate documents?" "Couple of years ago." "I'll come up Saturday," she said. "Get your paperwork together." She arrived with a box of Timbits and a yellow legal pad, sat down at my kitchen table, and got to work. She asked to see everything: the deed on the house, my RRSP and TFSA statements, my union pension documents, the beneficiary designations on my life insurance policy, the draft power of attorney I'd never finalized. She found no wrongdoing. She found something almost more unsettling. She found where the gaps were. Places in my affairs where a person with the right legal language and the right set of circumstances could potentially step in. "Your power of attorney," she said. "Nobody holds it. I've got a template with my lawyer, never executed it." Gail wrote something on her pad. That's the opening they're working toward. Over the following weeks, pieces began appearing from unexpected directions. A woman on my street mentioned she'd run into my daughter-in-law at an open house 2 blocks over. Unremarkable on its own. But my daughter-in-law had asked the agent, without prompting, about how quickly homes in my neighborhood typically moved. Then Alan mentioned, separately, in a different conversation, that someone had asked around at the credit union about the process for managing an elderly parent's finances when that parent was no longer considered capable of doing it themselves. I sat with that information for several days. I kept finding reasons to set it aside. Then Gail found something. She was helping me sort through a box of paperwork. Old contracts, archived correspondence from the company. When she stopped and slid a document across the table toward me. It was a printout of an email. Part of a thread she'd helped me archive when we were winding down the business. Attached to it was an inquiry that had been forwarded along. Someone had contacted an estate planning firm in Kingston, asking about the process for assuming financial control over an aging parent's accounts when that parent was displaying signs of cognitive decline, asking what documentation would be required, asking how quickly such arrangements could be put in place. The email address it came from belonged to my daughter-in-law. I read it twice, then a third time. Gail didn't say anything. She let me sit with it. "Maybe she was just researching," I said finally. "Being thorough." Gail looked at me with an expression I recognized, the kind a person wears when they're choosing not to say what they're thinking. "Lawrence," she said, very carefully, "you know what this is." I did know. I'd known for weeks. I just hadn't been ready to stop hoping otherwise. That night I got up at 2:15, made a cup of tea I didn't want, and stood at my kitchen window watching the street. The maple in the front yard was still. Someone's porch light was on down the block. A cat moved through the shadows and disappeared. On the wall by the back door was a framed photograph from my son's college graduation. George Brown, the business administration program, second time through. He was grinning in his cap and gown, holding the diploma with both hands like it might get away. I'd driven to Toronto and back in the same day to be there. I remember sitting in that auditorium thinking I'd never been prouder. I stood looking at that photograph for a long time. And for one honest moment, I want to say this plainly, because leaving it out would be dishonest. I thought about signing whatever they brought. I thought, maybe it's easier. Maybe this is just what getting older looks like. Maybe letting go is the graceful thing. That was the lowest point. And I'm telling you about it because people who tell these stories afterward tend to make themselves sound braver than they were. I wasn't brave that night. I was a 62-year-old man standing alone in his kitchen in the dark, wondering how much of himself he was willing to give away to keep from losing his son. The next morning, Gail came by and placed 2 documents on the table, without preamble. The first was a printout of public property inquiries. Nothing illegal, nothing action, just research, specific to my street, my block, filed recently. The second was a preliminary information request to a residential care facility in Napanee. No name. But the description could only have referred to one person. I read them both carefully. Then I put them down and called my lawyer. Not the family solicitor I'd been using for 20 years. A new one, a specialist in elder law named Maxine, out of a firm on Brock Street, who came recommended by the Kingston Community Legal Clinic. She was direct, methodical, and didn't try to soften any of it for me. On her advice over the following months, I did several things. I underwent a formal cognitive assessment at Kingston General Hospital. Not because I had any doubts about my own mind. I don't forget where I've put the car keys any more than I did at 45, but because I wanted it on record. Clean assessment. Dated, filed, notarized. I moved the bulk of my liquid assets into structures that were considerably harder to access without my explicit consent. My RRSPs and TFSAs were restructured. The beneficiary designations were updated and locked. My pension income arrangements were documented thoroughly. And I made a decision about the house. Every Labor Day weekend, I hosted a small gathering in my backyard. Old union friends, a couple of neighbors, my sister Constance, and her husband in from Brockville. Nothing elaborate, a propane barbecue, a cooler of Molson, lawn chairs on the grass, the kind of afternoon that doesn't need a reason. This year I invited my son and his wife. They accepted quickly. That told me something. They were still expecting things to go the way they'd planned. The Sunday was warm and clear, with that particular slant of late summer light that makes everything look like a photograph of itself. The maple in the back was just beginning to turn at the edges. Alan came. Constance and her husband drove up from Brockville, a few former colleagues. My neighbor across the street who always brings a pasta salad that nobody requests but everybody finishes. My son and his wife arrived around 4. He was carrying a 12-pack of Clamato and rye. My daughter-in-law hugged me warmly when she came through the gate, the kind of warmth that takes effort. I noticed the effort. Gail arrived an hour later. The second my daughter-in-law spotted her across the yard, her smile went tight. She said something quiet to my son. He turned, looked at Gail, and something in his posture changed. Not dramatically, but enough. He was good at controlling his face. He'd always been good at that. The afternoon moved along. People ate and talked and laughed. Someone told a story about fishing on the Rideau that went considerably longer than necessary. My sister Constance got into a spirited debate about the construction on Division Street. Normal things. The surface of things. Around 6:30, the crowd had thinned, and the light had gone long and gold across the grass. It felt like the right moment. I stood up and tapped my glass. Thanks for coming, everyone. A few smiles around the yard. There are a few things I want to say before the evening gets away from us. My son sat up straighter. His wife glanced at Gail, then back at me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't use the words betrayal or scheme or anything like them. I simply said that I'd spent several months getting my affairs organized, with help from Gail and from an estate lawyer, and that during that process I'd learned some things I felt I should share. I mentioned that I'd heard my name come up in connection with concerns about my mental capacity. Several faces turned toward my son. His expression stayed neutral. I mentioned the formal cognitive assessment. I said the results were on file and available to anyone who wanted to review them. I mentioned the preliminary inquiry to the care facility. I didn't look at my daughter-in-law when I said it. I didn't need to. I talked about the power of attorney documents they'd brought in June. I explained what I understood them to mean, specifically what authority they would have granted, under what conditions, and what would have been possible under that authority. I said I'd had them reviewed by 2 separate legal professionals. I said I wouldn't be signing them. My son interrupted. "Dad, that's not a fair representation of." "Which part isn't accurate?" I said. He stopped. "I'm genuinely asking," I said. "Which part?" He looked at his wife. She was looking at the grass. Neither of them spoke. Then my daughter-in-law reached for something solid. She was flustered, and when people are flustered, they reach for the thing that matters most to them. "Fine," she said. "But what's actually going to happen with the house? What's the actual plan?" The yard went quiet the way things go quiet, when everyone is paying attention at exactly the same time. My son closed his eyes for a moment. I waited a few seconds. Then I said, "Funny you should ask about the house." I reached into the folder I'd brought outside with me. I sold it in April. My son looked up sharply. "What?" "Firm sale. Closed in June." I looked around at him calmly. "I've been renting it back month to month while I finalize my move." My daughter-in-law stared at me. "You're still living here?" "For another 3 weeks," I said. What followed was not dramatic. It was the particular silence of people realizing that the map they've been using doesn't match the territory anymore. I told them about the condo, a smaller place on the waterfront, 2 bedrooms, a balcony with a view of Lake Ontario if you lean slightly to the left. Enough space for one person who'd stopped needing to impress anyone. Then I told them about the endowment. I'd worked with my lawyer and a Kingston area community foundation to establish a fund. Not enormous, but meaningful. The proceeds from the house sale, combined with a directed portion of my savings, would provide bursaries for apprentices in the skilled trades across Eastern Ontario. Pipe fitting, millwright, electrical, Red Seal programs. The same path I'd walked at 22 when I didn't know what else to do with myself. And a foreman took a chance on me. My son looked at me. "You gave it away." "Most of it," I said. "The parts that needed to go somewhere that mattered." "Dad." He said the word without anything attached to it. "I spent 38 years in the trades," I said. "The money came from those years. It made sense to send it back." My daughter-in-law stood up first. She didn't say anything else. She picked up her bag. My son stood after a moment and looked at me, a long look, the kind that has more inside it than the surface suggests, and then he followed her through the side gate. A minute later, I heard 2 doors and an engine, and then quiet. Nobody said much. Alan refilled his drink. Constance put her hand briefly on my shoulder and then went to get more pasta salad. Gail sat down in the empty chair beside mine, and we listened to the birds in the maple, doing what birds do at dusk. Moving day came 2.5 weeks later. I packed my own boxes. Slowly, with rest breaks, with CBC Radio 1 keeping me company. There were things in that house that stopped me mid-task. A shelf of manuals from job sites I'd half forgotten. A hook on the garage wall where my son used to hang his hockey bag on winter mornings before I drove him to early practice. I took the hook off the wall and wrapped it in newspaper and put it in a box. Some things deserve to be closed carefully. They still need to be closed. The first weeks in the condo were quiet in the way I'd needed quiet to be. Coffee on the balcony in the mornings. Walks along the waterfront in the afternoons. 2 mornings a week volunteering at a trades training center out on Division Street. That last one turned out to be the right decision in ways I hadn't expected. The students there were young and uncertain and occasionally brilliant. And they reminded me of who I'd been before I understood what kind of person I was going to become. One afternoon, a young man named Devon, 19, maybe 20, asked me how I'd gotten through the first year of apprenticeship when I doubted everything. We talked for a long time. Driving home in the early dark, I realized I'd gone several hours without thinking about my son. That felt significant in a way I couldn't quite articulate. He didn't call in September. He didn't call in October or November. I won't pretend the silence didn't hurt. People like the idea of a clean ending. The right thing done, justice served, everyone getting what they deserved. Real life is untidier than that. I stood my ground. I also spent certain evenings looking at my phone and wondering if the next call would ever come. It came on a Thursday in January. I was heating soup and half listening to the radio. I saw his name on the call display and stood there for a moment before answering. Dad. He sounded older. Not in years, in the way that happens when something has been sitting on a person for a while. We talked about small things first. The cold, which had been brutal. The Leafs, though neither of us had been following the season closely. My balcony, which was under about 14 centimeters of snow. Then he said, I lost my way for a while. I didn't answer right away. The debt got worse than Nicole was letting on, he said. Worse than I was letting on, even to myself. And I kept telling myself I was being practical, thinking ahead, taking care of things. He paused. But I know what it actually was. Was it her idea? I asked. A long silence. It was both of ours. I won't pretend it wasn't. That was honest. I respected the honesty. I think I stopped seeing you as a person, he said quietly. You became a situation to manage, and I convinced myself that was the same as caring about you. I looked out at the frozen lake. The ice had crept in from the edges, the way it does every January, gray-white and still. You never lost your father, I said, but my life was never yours to arrange. He was quiet for a moment, then, I understand that now. We are not what we were. I want to be honest about that too. Whatever we're building now, it's different. More deliberate, more careful, with less assumed and more said aloud. He calls on Sundays. Not every Sunday. Most of them. Last month he drove out to Kingston and we walked the waterfront in the cold with takeout coffees. Ice still on the lake at the far end. Clear sky. He asked about the bursary program and I told him about Devon and a few of the other students. He listened the whole way through without looking at his phone. Before he got in his car to drive home, he said, I think Mom would have liked what you did with the money. I thought about that on the walk back. About Judith and what she would have made of all of this. Probably that families are more complicated than anyone admits out loud, and that love, which cannot tolerate a boundary, is not quite love yet. I think she would have been right. Getting older teaches you things the brochure leaves out. Not just the obvious ones. The knees. The way funerals start appearing on the calendar with more frequency than weddings. The quieter ones. The way you finally stop performing who you are and start simply being that person. The way you realize that protecting what you've built isn't selfishness. It's a statement about how you intend to finish. You can love your family completely and still refuse to be managed by them. I spent a long time believing those two things couldn't coexist. Turns out they not only can, sometimes, holding the boundary is the only way the relationship survives long enough to become something real again. If any part of this sounds familiar to you, the slow drift, the questions that started feeling more like assessment than concern, the sick realization that someone was counting what you had. I want you to hear this clearly. You are allowed to protect yourself. You are allowed to move the pieces before someone else moves them for you. Your life belongs to you, all the way to the end.